and welcome to another edition of the Vinyl Record Collector. Today I'm going to be talking about a record that came out when I was 15 years old, but I really only became aware of it when I was 16, and it's called the Yes album. One of my favourite bands when I was growing up as a teenager, Yes, particularly this and the next album, Fragile, and there's probably a really good reason why those two stand out for me, although I've got pretty much everything that Yes produced over the years. My edition, by the way, is a bit of a hybrid. It's this is a heavy card original gatefold. It is a very stiff cover. It has a wide spine, and it's in great condition, and it has inside it a picture of the band members. So from here we got John Anderson, we got Bill Bruford. Moving over to here, we've got Steve Howe, and here we got the amazing Chris Squire on bass. And here, really, for me, the guy that helps to make this album stand out as being just one of the two best, and he was heavily involved in Fragile, the next album, as well, and it was his last official release with Yes. But this is Tony Kaye, keyboard player, really Hammond and piano player, I think we might call him, which will be obvious why we're calling him that. Anyway, there we are, that's the cover. Story of the cover of the Yes album is quite interesting. It's got here, Tony has got a cast on his foot. He'd been involved in a road accident and he broke his foot. The photograph is by a guy called Phil Franks. He put a 1,000-watt lamp in its normal light fitting and took this picture. And it's interesting. The only prop he had was this kind of mannequin's head here, and there it is, kind of suspended rather artistically over an empty chair. There is one other artist on it, a guy called Colin Goldring, who plays recorders on the first part of I've Seen All Good People, called Your Move, and the recorders are really noticeable on there, especially once you know those instruments are on there. You kind of look out for them. It was produced at Advision Studios in London. It was actually recorded in Devon at a farmhouse that Steve Howe ended up buying. The recording I have is a US first pressing. In fact, I've got two copies of this that I found in charity shops. Okay, so it says SDA 712139PR, and it has the correct stamp on the run out on the dead wax of the album as well. It's just a really fantastic sounding record. It's not particularly a thick record. I mean, it's a little bit flexible. It's not as flimsy as some of the later pressings would be. And I kind of half expected it to be a plum-coloured label, but anyway, it's not. And the first pressings of this are in this green and orange Atlantic pressing. So that's the SD8283 version. It's a bit of a hybrid because that's correct for the cover, but it's not correct for the liner. Because here you can see a later album close to the edge. In fact, it's got an album on here, the Jay Giles Band, which really dates this liner as probably 1973 or very late 1972, possibly kind of December 72 or sometime in 73. Because almost all of the albums on here are albums that appeared after, there's one or two exceptions, but after the Yes album was released. So that's not an original liner. It's not in great shape, but it does the job. And it's just when I found the record for 99 cents in Goodwill, that was the liner that it came with, and you know, so I just kind of live with that. I'm not sure what the original liner would have been. What is so special? What is so special about the Yes album? It was the first album that they produced where they wrote all of the tracks themselves. There are no cover versions on it, and also what you get is this feel of the kind of blending of the different styles and tastes. It was a really transitional album because it was the first album where Steve Howe was really involved. He recently joined the band, and he's a legendary guitarist. I saw Yes live at the Marriott Theatre in Indianapolis in 2013, in August 2013, with a different vocalist, but with the rest of the lineup, including on this occasion Rick Wakeman. But Steve Howe is still an amazing guitarist, and he's just one of these guys that has so many styles and kind of genres at his disposal that you never know what he's going to come up with from one minute to the next. And that's a feature of this album. The only track which is fully attributed to him, which everyone raves about, called Clap, or The Clap, depending on which version you're looking at, I think is the weakest track of all. It's a live track at the Lyceum in London. It just doesn't seem to fit. It doesn't seem to fit with the rest of the album. The Yes album not only has original music, but it also has the typical close harmonies that Yes were really producing by this stage. And clearly Yes without John Anderson wouldn't really be Yes at all. And not only are his vocals amazing, but you also get the impression that he's very much the kind of the choral master of the band, and kind of directing the vocal work. So it has that kind of beautiful blend of voices that you get with Yes, which is actually really sophisticated for rock bands at the time. Yeah, there were the Beatles were doing great harmonies, but in terms of the close blending, these close harmonies, Yes were really masters of the art at this time. And in addition to the amazing harmonies, there's the just sheer musicality of the band. And when you've got Squire on bass, who is just a complete maestro. There's a few bass players that I just have a huge amount of time for, and he is certainly one of them. And what he brings to the band is that extra dimension. Another of my great favourites is John Entwistle, for the same reason, that he doesn't just sit there and do the basic rhythm that a bass player would normally bring to a record, but he actually has this whole capacity for what I would call lead bass. You can easily listen to a Yes album and just follow the bass all the way through, and you'll hear amazing things. You just think, wow, that's so much just like a lead guitar, but just played in the lower register. Obviously, the drumming is extremely tight. By this time, they were really getting used to playing a lot together. They were gigging all the time. What you're hearing here is definitely a band that's got its act together, knows how to blend the sounds. I think that's maybe why, with the Steve Howe stuff coming in, it feels a little bit kind of jammed in there, because he was the kind of Johnny come lately of the band at this stage. In the rest of his work, Steve Howe on the album, it's absolutely fantastic, and his styles seem to just fit the music very, very well. So I imagine they were thrilled with the results of the work that he did on it. The thing that sets not just this album, but also the subsequent album, Fragile, apart for me, is the work of Tony Kaye. And I'm going to nail my colours to the mast here, and you may feel completely differently, but I think that when Tony Kaye left the band, and the reasons I've read about him leaving the band is to do with the other band members maybe wanted more experimentation with synthesized sounds or keyboard sounds, or the programming that Rick Wakeman would get so involved with. What they lost, I think, was an instrument that kind of didn't overpower, but really really added to the musicality of the tracks on this album and on Fragile. And I think although Wakeman appeared on as the keyboardist on Fragile, the work was already largely written when Tony Kaye was still there with the band, because there's a very short time between the release of the Yes album, which came out in February of 1971, and the November release of Fragile in that same year. So you've got kind of 9 months, and that's release date to release date. So we know that they were working on Fragile as a band throughout most of that summer. And obviously when Wakeman came, a lot of the ideas for the music had already been well developed. You look at an album like this, and it appears to have 3 tracks on each side, and yet by the end of either of the sides, and you're just thinking to yourself, well, you know, there was at least kind of 8, 9 or 10 different songs on that side woven in. It was almost like a medley of what the band members were bringing to the table, and I think that's either a good or a bad thing. I don't think it always is easy on the ear, because you know, there is a track on the Yes album that quite honestly is quite hard work, and I'll talk about that at the end when we come to that track. The album opens with Yours Is No Disgrace, which became a Yes live performance classic. It really opens up with a little bit of a kind of cameo from each of the musicians, really almost kind of showing off their skills. It's really, it opens with a very powerful guitar riff, and it really makes you think, you know, yeah, this is going to be a strong track, and it is indeed a strong track. And what Yours Is No Disgrace really conveys is the notion of progressive music. It really is music which evolves through various stages. And in that sense, a lot of the rock that we were listening to in the late 60s, early 70s, and certainly from the early to the mid 70s, what we call progressive music, that was the term that we used at the time. And it was in a sense probably borrowing more from jazz and extemporizing, and the kind of almost just trying different things out. One of the reasons why, you know, we love Pink Floyd so much is you could be listening to a track and they bring in sound effects or special effects or whatever. I talk about some of these ideas in my exploration of metal. On an earlier video. Yes, we're bringing in these progressive ideas. They're literally a progression through the song, not progressive in any other sense. You know, I think that sometimes we try and impart to music meanings which at the time it didn't really have. For us, progressive music was a style of music where you would maybe move on from just the simple kind of blues-based rock. We had that with bands like Led Zeppelin, we had it with bands like Fleetwood Mac and Free, but in no way would we call those progressive music bands. Progressive music for me was people like Wishbone Ash, it was people like Yes, it was people like Pink Floyd, where they were really much more experimental in their approaches to song. Yours Is No Disgrace then gives way to Clap, or The Clap, depending on whose version you want to take. I understand that the original intention was from Steve Howe that it would just be called Clap. You go from this very rich progressive track into what is very much an acoustic live, with all the ambient sounds of an acoustic live performance in the Lyceum. So you got kind of audience, kind of a feel that the audience is there, there's some audience noise, but also there's the kind of slightly hollow sound. And I'd call it almost a thin sound that you get from that track. And everybody raved, all the critics raved about this track. It's fantastic guitar work, but I don't know what it's doing on this point of the album. It's almost like, I don't think it belongs on the album. That's how I feel about it. I love this album, but I don't think it belongs on it. It always feels stuck into me. Never feels like it's really a seamless part of it. So consequently, you get this end of a rich track, you then get this live track, which I think is in some ways incongruous. And then that incongruity gets even worse because the next track that comes on is Starship Trooper. So you've now got this this other powerful, almost timeless Yes classic, and they bookend this little acoustic track in between. Anyway, you may feel differently about it, and don't get me wrong, I love Steve Howe's music, and I could really enjoy that track in another album, but I would have liked to have had another progressive music track on this album at that point. But in spite of what I'm saying about Steve Howe, his contribution to Starship Trooper is immense. You know, the guitar work is really, really excellent on that track. So in no way am I criticizing his general contribution to the album. And side one is it's about 22.5 minutes long if it's played at the correct speed. Side two's a little bit shorter. You're looking at just over 19 minutes on side two. And again, it comprises 3 tracks. It starts off with another Yes classic, I've Seen All Good People. Side 2 is really just Anderson and Squire. It gets away with it because it's very much a vocal track with strong musical backing. I think that Your Move, the kind of first part of I've Seen All Good People, it really features very, very strong but quite sparse kind of backing to the vocal. You feel like it's very much just kind of bass and percussion and Anderson's vocals over the top. It doesn't have the kind of heavy involvement of Kaye or Howe in that track. There is involvement, but I think the general impression is that it's drum and bass, but not in the sense of a modern drum and bass. So if you like, it's bass first, then drum, and a sort of strong vocal with all the kind of paraphernalia of chess moves almost, you know, in the lyric. Now that track, Your Move, is also the one that features the recorder work by Colin Goldring. And it works. I mean, it works really, really well. You know, I had a sister who was attempting to learn the recorder at school, the descant recorder, I think it was. Anyone at school in those days, if you couldn't do anything else, there were certain instruments that they would try and get you to play. The violin, the tambourine, if you were tuneless, or the triangle if you were both tuneless and had almost no sense of rhythm, and the recorder, and that was about it. Though we had the glockenspiel as well, you know. So that was about the sum total of our exposure to musical instruments. I think maybe there might have been some cymbals in there, but they were the type that you crash together. They weren't like drumming cymbals. Anyway, I digress. But the recorder was just something that you think, oh gosh, no, don't, please stop playing the recorder. Goldman plays it brilliantly, of course. I mean, a professional musician, classically trained, I guess, or whatever. Or maybe just spent a lot of time in music lessons at school. But anyway, it works really, really well on this track. Who knows? He might have been at school with some of the guys and he said, oh, you play recorder pretty well. Who can say? Tony Kaye's work on I've Seen All Good People just has such a breadth of feel to it. He does achieve almost like a cathedral organ sound, which I presume is on the Hammond B3 that he was playing. I think he may have also experimented on this with a Moog synthesizer, but certainly he has this great kind of swelling cathedral sound in it. And this idea of progressive music was that anything goes. You could just try anything. So here we have a recorder, and now we've got this kind of cathedral organ. It's all in the same track, and the track has multiple parts. And then Howe's guitar work comes into play as well, and he does like an up-tempo kind of jazz part to the song. Yes, we're quite happy to start off with 1 meter, you know, so many beats to the bar, and then change to a completely different meter. Yes, probably represents the band that you would never want to be dancing with a girl, because you never knew from one minute to the next whether it was going to be a slow or a fast or whatever. I mean, so you had your singles for that purpose. You didn't work with progressive music. It was rubbish to dance to. But that isn't the point of it. We used it for listening to. Now, on the second track on side two, is a track that Anderson wrote called Adventure. And it just starts out with a kind of very delicate, almost like a duet between Kaye and Howe. And my understanding is that musically they didn't really see eye to eye. But I tell you what, it's only maybe the first bar or two of Adventure where the two of them are playing before Anderson starts singing. It's a really sweet piece of work, very, very gentle and laid back. And side two, the album, and the whole album is finished with Perpetual Change. And I think what you can say about Perpetual Change is it changes all the way through. It changes in its rhythm, it changes in the kind of the feel of it. It has very often a feel of almost like southern rock. I mean, there's parts of it that immediately remind me of bands like Alabama, and then there's very much kind of up-tempo, traditional kind of jazz feel to some of the guitar work as well. And again, these frequent changes in tempo. It's actually quite a hard song to listen to. I mean, if you start out tapping your foot to it and then try and maintain that all the way through, I've never really tried to do that, but I've listened to the track enough times to know that it's probably not going to work for me. I love the track, but it feels a bit like a free-for-all. When I look at the Yes album, I experience certainly real moments of greatness in some of the musicianship. I can hear what I think of as the potential. The story is that it was the album that saved Yes's commercial lives, because Atlantic was going to drop them, and their previous work hadn't been commercially successful. As with a lot of cover bands, I suppose. Remembering that even the Beatles started out singing covers, and a lot of the bands at that time were cover bands, and that was how they learned their trade. But the fact that their first really commercially successful album was based entirely on stuff they wrote themselves, it just spoke volumes for what the public wanted. They wanted something different. And I think that's what you get with the Yes album. You get a seismic shift into something which you cannot categorize as blues-based rock. It is now something different. It is true progressive music. It's one of the albums that stands out as really marking this complete change, probably even more so than the original Wishbone Ash album. That itself contained very much blues tracks, and although it had fantastic progressive music like Handy, you felt that it was a bit of a mixture of a blues album with progressive music. With the Yes album, I felt that this was something different. It doesn't make it onto my 10 Desert Island discs, and Fragile does. When I talk about Fragile in a later video, I'll explain what sets Fragile apart from not only this album, but from many of the other albums at the time that came out in the early 70s. And I think the interesting thing is that summer when Yes were working from the transition of having just released the Yes album with a body of work that would become Fragile was probably just an amazing, amazing time for the band. And for me, it was the peak of their writing activity. You may feel differently. If you feel differently, leave your comments below. Bye for now.